Welcome to Malabar Farm, the home of world-famous author, conservationist, and farmer Louis Bromfield. Born in Mansfield, Ohio in 1896, Bromfield created his dream, Malabar Farm. Built in 1939, this beautiful 32-room country home is a blend of Western Reserve architecture. The home appears just as Bromfield left it after his death in 1956. Join us as we tour this National Historic Landmark and Ohio treasure.
Let's begin here in the front hallway. This is where one of the most famous weddings in Hollywood history took place. Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall were married here in 1945.
The actual ceremony took place right here on the double staircase. They told me this double staircase is a Jeffersonian-style staircase. Double stairs and a central landing, which is called flying or freestanding. The piano here in the corner is a Steinway. This was Mrs. Bromfield's piano. It was purchased for her in 1939. I remember that tune well. Play it again, Mrs. Bromfield.
Louis Bromfield loved dogs, and they were a big part of the household, and the double staircase was where they liked to run. They would run up and around the staircase, and a lot of times they would sit over on the right-hand side at the top. That way they had a clear view out the front door, and they could see who was coming up the walk. Well, there is not much room up there for those big dogs, since most of them were boxers. They had to fight for space. In fact, you can see a crack on this beautiful French apothecary jar, innocent victim of one of the dog disputes. The paintings in this hallway we call the 8 Spanish Ladies in Waiting. They were painted by Zamora of Spain in the 1700s. After doing some research, we have found that the original painter was Zurbarán, and these were copies. Zamora was actually a copy artist. The ladies are handmaidens of the Queen, and they were made to look like they were pregnant. Actually, they wore wire cages on the front of them to make their dresses appear fuller. As styles go, in the 1600s, when you were heavy, you were perceived to be wealthy. So that look was definitely in. Here is a picture of Louis Bromfield himself at about age 50. Let's move on to what's known as the sitting room. Louis Bromfield added on to the original house quite a bit. This room is in the older part of the home. This portion of the house is over 150 years old, and it was in this part of the house where the Bromfields actually spent most of their time. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Bromfield that they had painted while they were living in France. It was done in 1930. He was 34 and she was 38. To the right is an original Grandma Moses painting called Springtime. We will see another one upstairs later that is a winter scene. Grandma Moses gave 2 paintings to Louis back in the late 1940s. He had written a very nice introduction to one of her books, and it was her way of saying thank you. Then on the next wall, we have a picture and a frame done by a famous artist named Jimmy Reynolds, a good friend of the Bromfields. He designed much of the wallpaper in the house, but this was one of the designs they didn't care too much for, and they turned him down on it. The first Christmas they were in the house, he put it in a frame and wrapped it up and gave it to them for a Christmas present, and said he was going to get that design on their walls any way he could. How about this television set? It's a 1951 Zenith, and Mr. Bromfield was known to turn the television set on for his dogs. It seemed the boxers enjoyed watching television. The pictures right above it, the 2 oval frames, are Mr. Bromfield's grandparents. The rectangular frame is Mrs. Bromfield's family. Her mother is the older of the 2 girls shown. I'd like you to look at all the books we have in the bookcases. As we go through the house, you'll see books in nearly every room, over 4,000 volumes in all. Over here on the table is a photograph of the home in 1939, the way it looked when the Bromfields first purchased it from the Herrings. This is before their new construction was added. Now this is Mrs. Bromfield's bedroom. We have a headboard that contains 10 of her favorite books written by her husband. It was designed by her cousin Ruby Wood. This bed is where she died in 1952 of a heart attack at only 60 years of age. Mr. Bromfield died 4 years later in 1956 of bone cancer and hepatitis at the age of 59. We think he accomplished a lot in that short lifetime, 33 best-selling books, and so many good farming techniques that he is today called the father of sustainable agriculture. On the desk are 3 pictures of their daughters. Anne, the oldest, is on the left. She was born in 1924. She never married and lives in Bozeman, Montana. Right next to her is Hope, the middle child, 4 years younger than Anne. Hope lives in Helena, Montana on a wildlife conservation ranch. To her right is Ellen, the youngest daughter, born in 1933. Ellen lives in Sao Paulo, Brazil with her husband Carson. Together, they raised 5 children and have 13 grandchildren. Ellen is also an author. She wrote a book called The Heritage about her memories of growing up here at Malabar Farm. By the way, the pictures are standing on a desk that the Bromfields brought over from the old monastery where they lived for a time in France. Now, over on the other wall, we have a beautiful fireplace of Georgian marble. Mr. Bromfield wrote in his book Pleasant Valley that he got that from an antique dealer in New Orleans. It had been in a home that burnt down during the Civil War, but was originally from France. Right above the fireplace on either side of the mirrors are 2 unusual paintings called reverse paintings. They are painted on the underside of the glass, and we are told these are from the 1700s. Now, the carpeting in here has been down for almost 60 years. We get thousands of people through the house every year. For wool carpeting, it has held up really well. But the Bromfields had a lot of boxer dogs, and it looks like they had a few accidents here and there. This is Louis Bromfield's study. He used this room as a place where he could write, as his farm office, and since he only required 2 or 3 hours a night of sleep, he also used it as his bedroom. Bromfield designed the big, beautiful desk that you see here. It is made of solid black walnut and has 29 drawers. He was very excited the day the desk arrived. Anxious to take his typewriter off of the card table, put it on his new desk, sit down and get busy. Unfortunately, he discovered that he had designed the desk too high. Mr. Bromfield was 6'2", but the desk was still too high for typing. So back on the card table the typewriter went. And toward the end of his life he wrote in one of his last books that this was the spot he liked best after all, because he could look out the window and he loved the outdoors. We see a document that he was given when he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1927 for his book Early Autumn. Back then you were awarded $1,000 if you won. Today I think it's over $100,000. Over on the other side of the room we see a portrait of 4 dogs and a cat. This was an advertisement that Calvert Whiskey asked Mr. Bromfield to be in. Since he did not use their product, he didn't feel that he should be in the ad. But he offered his boxer dogs for the ad, and they thought it was a good idea. Bromfield had 5 boxers at the time, but his favorite dog, Prince, would not cooperate with the sitting, so they took him out, and later replaced him with a cat. Her name just happened to be Lana Turner. That ad appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in the late 1940s. As we go to our right, we see a bookcase that holds most of the books Mr. Bromfield wrote. Many are duplicated in foreign languages, some in up to 25 different languages. The ones on the left in the dark covers with the gold trim were the 7 books that were turned into movies. Mrs. Parkington and The Rains Came are 2 of the more popular titles. Right underneath the Calvert Whiskey painting is an award that Louis Bromfield got from a gardening institute in France, a very high award given to him because he introduced American vegetables to the people of France. When he lived in the old monastery, he had quite a nice garden and beautiful flowers. When people of France would come to visit, they did not recognize sweet corn, Hubbard squash, lima beans, and others. Later in life, Louis said that award meant more to him than his Pulitzer Prize for Early Autumn in 1927. Well, Mr. Bromfield found that with having so many dogs, it would be a good thing to have a dog door installed in his office. It worked out great for a long time, but we found out in Ellen's book that after a while, other animals found out they could use the door too. She wrote in her book that one time a raccoon got in, and another time a skunk. Well, that visitor was reason enough to nail the door shut. The dogs liked to be with Mr. Bromfield, and while he was in his office writing, many times they'd be on the couch or curled up in one of the little chairs, even if they were a little too big for it. The bust behind the typewriter is Voltaire, the famous French philosopher. When Mr. Bromfield did his writing, a lot of people thought his writing was very satirical and maybe a little like Voltaire back in his day. Here we are upstairs in George Hawkins's room. George was the Bromfield's secretary and business manager. This room was designed by Mr. and Mrs. Bromfield to look like George's New York apartment at the St. Regis Hotel. They even went so far as to use the same kind of cypress wood. George, a city boy, was reluctant to move to Malabar. To make him feel more at home, Mr. Bromfield and his daughters painted a picture of the view that George actually had out of his New York apartment. Mr. Bromfield told him if he would at least give the job a try, if he felt lonesome for New York, he could close the shutters and look at that painting, and he should feel right at home. It must have worked. George stayed here until his death in 1948, and all during the time he worked for the Bromfields, he remained an agent for movie stars. He was able to go to New York or Hollywood, and they were able to come here and visit. Many times his guests on their first visit were in for quite a surprise. Mr. Bromfield insisted that every guest help with the chores. In her book, Louie's daughter Ellen recalls many examples. For instance, she remembers famous star Joan Fontaine coming out in the middle of the night in her robe and slippers to assist in the birth of a calf. Kay Francis, another very famous star of the 1930s, who was also here on many occasions, was given the task of making the yearly apple butter. This was done in the late fall. Ellen said it was quite amusing to look out and see this huge celebrity tending a big black kettle over a wood fire, dressed in sort of a Greta Garbo-type outfit, complete with dark glasses and a cigarette holder dangling out of her mouth. Louie even had Jimmy Cagney, another frequent guest at the farm, selling vegetables up at the spring next to the Malabar Inn.
That's right. If any guest refused or didn't think they could do the farm chores, all of a sudden all the beds were filled here at Malabar Farm. And the chauffeur would very politely take them into the Leland Hotel in Mansfield, where he'd drop them off before supper hour and pick them up again the next morning. So if you didn't help with the chores, you didn't get to stay at Malabar Farm, see?
Here in George Hawkins' room, we have the other original Grandma Moses painting, called The Postman Cometh. So many people have come through the house and suggested, wouldn't this make a beautiful Christmas stamp? We are very fortunate to have these paintings. Here is a picture of Grandma Moses, and part of the introduction that Louie Bromfield wrote for her book, the reason she gave him 2 of her original paintings. Over on the window seat, we have a pencil drawing of George Hawkins, and a picture of him with Mr. Bromfield and some of the dogs. We have a painting here done by Velázquez, quite a famous South American artist. The hallway outside of George's room is covered with pictures of some of the many movie stars who often came to visit him, including some who were in the movie The Rains Came. That movie, made from one of Louie's books, actually premiered in Mansfield in 1939.
And what a premiere it was! Some of Hollywood's brightest turned out. There was George Brandt, Myrna Loy, Tyrone Power, and many others. Probably one of the biggest nights of champagne dreams and caviar wishes ever seen in Mansfield, Ohio.
Most of the movie stars pictured on this wall were clients of George Hawkins. There were many, many more movie stars that visited. We just kind of ran out of wall space. This is a guest bedroom Mr. Bromfield always referred to as the Black Room because of the beautiful wallpaper. We are told that this is called alpine floss, a little flower that grows in the Swiss Alps. It's kind of funny because, though large on this wallpaper, the alpine floss is actually a very tiny flower. This is still in the older part of the home, which was remodeled back in 1939 when the Bromfields first bought the home and started to add on to it. This is one of the guest bathrooms, also put in when the home was remodeled. It is quite unusual because it was built around a staircase. The Bromfields still wanted access to the attic, but they also wanted a bathroom. So they compromised and installed the bathroom right around the staircase. You can still get up into the attic through here. This is another guest bedroom. We call it the honeymoon room because this is where Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall spent their honeymoon night. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that there was quite an age difference. He was 45, she was only 20 when they were married here at Malabar Farm. Well, at least that's what she put on the marriage certificate. The daughter of the judge that married them claims that Lauren Bacall was really only 19 at the time. We do get a lot of teasing about the twin beds in here. We have noticed that these are the only beds in the entire house that have rollers on the bottom. We point that out and let it go at that. The bedspreads have Mrs. Bromfield's initials on them, MBA, which stands for Marie Appleton Bromfield. These look like they're machine-stitched because they're so perfect, but actually they're hand-stitched. Here you see pictures of the Humphrey Bogart postage stamp that came out in 1997. They celebrated the first day issue in Hollywood, but because of the famous marriage, we celebrated the second day issue right here at Malabar. There are also some wonderful paintings on the walls of this room. Those in the red frames are original Audubon prints dating from the 1840s. We are very fortunate again to have these. Over in the corner, we have some of Mrs. Bromfield's rooster collection. We often wonder why she liked to collect roosters and found out that the rooster is the national symbol for France, the way the eagle is for the United States. Given the fact that the Bromfields spent 15 years in France, it's no wonder we see roosters throughout the house. As we go through the house, we see beautiful unpainted wooden doors. These are all solid black walnut. The floor is oak with walnut pegs, and all this wood came from right here on the farm. As we come out into the staircase area, we are now entering the newer part of the house. On either side of this guest room door, we have two paintings done by Sir Francis Rose of the courtyard at the old monastery the Bromfields lived in while they were in France. After doing some research, we found out that, like the Grandma Moses paintings, these are also very valuable. Mr. Bromfield wanted to give the idea of having a high ceiling, so he lowered the railings on the staircase, and it gives the optical illusion of having a higher ceiling. We are now in the girls' sitting room. This is where they entertain their friends. One of the most interesting things in the room is a cabinet full of wonderful treasures the girls collected during their childhood. Items from all over the world, and just little things that caught their fancy, like the Mickey and Minnie Mouse figurine. This is what they looked like when Walt Disney first created them. On the next shelf down are some little glass animals the girls said they got free out of Cracker Jack boxes. Like the Disney figurine, today they are quite the collector's item. On the wall opposite the cabinet, we have two animation cells from the cartoon Ferdinand the Bull that Louis wrote for that very same Walt Disney. Mr. Disney had read the book, originally written many years ago by Monroe Leaf, and thought it would make a wonderful cartoon. He needed somebody to write the script, so he asked Mr. Bromfield. Walt Disney remembered that Louis Bromfield had 3 daughters, and he decided to send 2 animation cells to the girls. The one on the right is Ferdinand, and the one on the left is his mother. You remember the story of Ferdinand, the reluctant bull. He is the bull that did not want to fight, just wanted to smell the flowers. We also have an old radio in this room, a 1939 Zenith shortwave with standard and police bands. It has been reconditioned and still works today, picking up stations all over the world. Of course, you see more books in this room. The whole family were avid readers, and so were many of their guests. On the wall is an aerial view of the farm done in 1945, the same year Bogey and Bacall were married here. The farm is pretty much the same today. Here are 5 photographs of the family that look to be taken when Louis was about 4 years old. His father is on the right, his mother on the left. The baby is his little brother Charles, and the beautiful young woman in the center is his older sister Marie. Mr. Bromfield's father was Richland County Treasurer at the time, and a copy of this photo still hangs in the courthouse in Mansfield today.
We were sitting in what used to be known as the children's sitting room upstairs. And the thing that I most remember about this room was I spent as little time in it as possible. I only stayed in here when it was raining. When it wasn't raining, the whole farm was our playground. And we wandered over the whole farm. We wandered down Schweitzer's Creek and up in the hills into the Ferguson Place and down through the caves. We wandered everywhere. And when we weren't wandering on foot, or I myself, I had a wonderful old horse called Red. And I used to spend a lot of time riding him, as well as a lot of time in his stall in the barn. I loved him, I brushed him, and then I'd sit on a bale and watch him eat his hay and oats. And of course we raised little orphan lambs as well, so sometimes I would sit and feed an orphan lamb with a bottle and still watch Red. That was the kind of thing that, that I remember about my childhood. This room was a room where you came when it was raining. And if there were friends here, which I often had friends, lots and lots of friends here, so this would be our starting base. And the thing that we would do would be leave this room and crawl on our bellies through the whole house, all the way down the stairs and through the kitchen and the dining room and everything else, and back up the back stairs and back to here. That was the end of the end place. Who got there first? And then, if it was still raining, my English governess, Nanny, had a wonderful game that we played, which was, we called it Spider's Web. And you'd tie a string to a doorknob, and you'd have the whole roll of string, and you'd just tie it to everything in the room until you really were so entangled in the web you couldn't get out. And then when that got worn out, we played Monopoly and Mahjong and things like that. And when I was alone, I remember we had a gramophone or a Victrola or whatever we called it in those days. And I put on records, and I loved ballets. I used to play a lot of ballet and dance. And sometimes the dancing would get downstairs. We'd dance with the whole family in the hall. Sometimes I'd dance by myself up here. My favorite, I think, of all was Firebird. And when I got tired of that, I would lie down on that sofa over there and find a book. And then I would...
No shortage of books in this
No shortage of books in this house. And I would immerse myself in fairy tales. Grimm's fairy tales and the books of Oz, Dr. Dolittle. That is how I remember this place.
Each one of the Bromfield girls had their own bedroom, with an extra bed in it for an overnight guest. The girls were allowed to pick out their own wallpaper, and it's still the same. The daughters did a lot of the artwork on the walls. And again, you see there are books everywhere. The floors are the original linoleum. A lot of people wonder why the girls had linoleum on their floors. Well, they had a lot of friends over. They liked to go hiking and horseback riding, and as you can imagine, this was just a lot easier to keep clean. This was Anne's, the eldest daughter's room, called the Blue Bedroom. Anne had a nice painting of Hope hanging here, done by a school friend. This is the wallpaper Anne chose for her room, and of course, we have more books. Anne was known to have her nose stuck in a book at all times. This was Hope, the middle daughter's bedroom. Here is some of her artwork. And this is the wallpaper that she picked out. The wallpaper in this house has really held up well. As we enter the living room, we like to emphasize that the room actually served three separate purposes. It was, of course, a living room, but sometimes the Bromfields would take all the furniture out and they would have dances here, with the Lucas High School band playing in the entry hall. It also served as an extra bedroom because inevitably the Bromfields would end up with more guests than they had beds. So you can imagine coming down in the morning finding extra people in the living room. This manuscript is an original written by E.B. White, complete with corrections. He reviewed Mr. Bromfield's book Malabar Farm for the New Yorker magazine. It was written in poetry form, and Mrs. Bromfield liked it so much she had the original matted and framed, and it has been here ever since. This lamp used to be part of a matching set. What happened to the other lamp makes for an interesting story. Apparently, Humphrey Bogart's third wife, Mayo Martha, was here with him in the early 1940s. While Louis was taking Mayo around the grounds, Bogey had retired here to the living room. When Mayo and Louis came in, Mayo's mink coat had burrs all over it. Bogey made the mistake of commenting on her appearance. She then proceeded to pick up the other lamp and toss it at him, along with anything else she could find that wasn't nailed down. Here we have a watercolor called a black and white wash of the Bromfields' home just outside of Paris in Senlis, France. A former 16th century monastery that had been converted into a chateau, this was the home that the Bromfields occupied between 1930 and 1938. They gave Sunday buffet dinners and would invite artists, writers, and movie stars, up to about 40 people every Sunday. The dining room was one of Louis's favorites. He loved the lighting effect created by the bay windows and used them wherever the architecture would permit. The dining room table could accommodate up to 40 guests. The candle-lit chandelier dates from the 1700s and hung in their living room in France. The Bromfields enjoyed candlelight and never had it converted to electricity. The solid cherry sideboard was a favorite piece of the Bromfields. It is dated about 1750. Notice the shell motif on the wall sconces. There's an interesting story behind these. At one time, Bromfield was a theater critic for the New York Herald Tribune. One night, he saw the legendary producer Max Reinhardt's A Midsummer Night's Dream on Broadway. In his column, Louis said the play wasn't very good, but the set decorations were worth going to see. Unfortunately, the play failed a few days later. Max Reinhardt then took and boxed all the shell sconces up and sent them to Bromfield. Years later, Bromfield brought these from France, where he had kept them since the early 1920s, and incorporated them not only in the dining room, but also in the upper stairway and the entry hall as well. The oldest piece in the Bromfield house is this game table with its sweeping legs. We do not know the exact year, but it dates from sometime during the 1600s. This swinging door provides a good example of the many scratches that are found throughout the house. Bromfield's boxers always had complete run of the household. They were not trained animals, so inevitably they did a lot of damage. It was said that not too long after the Bromfields moved in here, the place looked as if it had already been lived in for several years. The kitchen itself is divided into two rooms. One side, where all the cooking was done, contained a restaurant-sized gas Magic Chef stove with 6 burners, a double deep fryer, and a grill. A lot of cooking went on in here. We have one of the first in-home dishwashers that was made by Hobart. This was installed way back in 1952. This is the butler's pantry, and all the dishes were kept in the cupboard out here. There's also a warming oven that goes on through to the butler's side. The cook could put food in there when it was done. It would stay warm, and the server could take it out of the other side and serve it when all the guests were seated. On the wall there above the shelf, we have a picture of Louis Bromfield and some of his dogs. The dogs were never supposed to be allowed in the kitchen, but judging by the picture, they made it in here on at least one occasion. Must have been the cook's day off. This is what's known as a gas servile refrigerator. Today, we do not have it hooked up because you have to defrost them every week. This was a good thing to have back in those days because the Bromfields got free gas. They had 5 gas storage wells here on the property, and they got free gas for cooking and heating. I understand there are no moving parts on the refrigerator, and they never break. The only thing you would ever have to replace on one of those would be the handle or the gasket around the door. A lot of companies gave Mr. Bromfield things to use, and one of these companies was the Jeep Company. They gave Louis a 1946 Willys Jeep, and he had it here at the farm all these years. It was recently restored. When we convert our gift shop back into a garage, we are going to display the Jeep. That concludes our tour for today. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you'll come back and see us again.